Hi everyone, I am Cleber Ten Caten and I am a PhD student in the Dallas lab here at the University of South Carolina. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the poster that I presented in the BES Market Ecology Conference in 2021. So in this project, we were interested in looking at the temporal and spatial consistency of abundance occupancy relationships. So abundance occupancy relationships, they predict that species abundance is positively correlated to species occupancy, such that species that are widespread would also be more locally abundant. There are several mechanisms that have been proposed to explain the occurrence of positive abundance occupancy relationships, such as, for example, the resource availability hypothesis. The resource availability hypothesis predicts that if a resource is widespread and abundant, then the species that use that resource, they would also be widespread and more abundant than the species that don't use that resource. Similarly, if species with broader niches are able to tolerate more variable environmental conditions and use variable resources, then those species, they would also be more widespread and more locally abundant than other species. However, if we are not being able to sample rare species in a site, then we might observe a positive correlation between species occupancy and abundance, not because of a biological mechanism, but because of a sampling artifact. In general, there has been a general support for the occurrence of positive abundance occupancy relationships, but it's still not very well understood whether or not these relationships, they tend to be temporally and spatially consistent. So for example, some studies, they have found that abundance occupancy relationships, they are relatively stable across different spatial scales, whereas other studies have found that these relationships can become weaker, or even an inverse pattern can be observed at larger spatial scales. Similarly, it has also been observed for some studies that abundance occupancy relationships, they tend to be temporally stable, but other studies have found that abundance and occupancy relationships, they tend to become weaker over time. So here, we use the National Ecological Observatory network data to evaluate the occurrence of abundance and occupancy relationships for four terrestrial taxa, small mammals, birds, beetles, and ticks, and 3 aquatic taxa, macroinvertebrates, zooplankton, and fishes. And we obtain abundance and occurrence data for all these taxa at 3 spatial scales. We obtain data for the plot spatial scale, for the site spatial scale, and for the domain spatial scale from the years of 2014 through 2019. So in the NEON data set, the species occurrence and abundance data, they are collected following a standardized sampling scheme, where the same sampling protocol is used to sample the species data across all the sites where the data is collected. So here in the left-hand side of the figure, we have a representation of the NEON sites and of the different spatial scales that were considered in our project. So here, the domain spatial scale can be represented by all these different polygons with different colors over here. So there is a total of 20 domains. And in each of those domains, we have sites that are being sampled. In those sites, in the NEON data set, there are 47 terrestrial sites being sampled and 34 aquatic sites being sampled. And here the sites, they are being represented by the black dots in the map. And in each one of those sites, as we can see here in this part of the figure, there are several plots being sampled. In this specific example, we have a case where 5 plots would be sampled in a specific site. On the right-hand side of the figure, we can see how the patterns of species abundance and occupancy could change over time. So that species that were highly abundant in one year could be less abundant in the next year. So we obtain abundance and occurrence data for all these species, for all these taxa, and then we calculated the species abundance as the local mean abundance, where we accounted for sampling effort, such as, for example, some sites, they might have more traps than other sites, or some plots, I should say, might have more traps than other plots, or those traps, they might be set for a longer period of time. So we took that into account when calculating the species abundance. And then we calculated the species occupancy as the fraction of sample locations where a species was found. So for example, if we sampled 10 sites and a species was found in 6 sites, the species occupancy would be 0.6 or 60%. And then we use the linear regressions to evaluate the relationship between the species abundance and occupancy. Here we use a interspecific approach where each species for a given taxa is treated as a data point. And then in order to understand whether or not these relationships, they are temporally and spatially stable, we use the linear mixed effect model, where we had the standardized slope of the linear regressions that we ran for each taxa as the response variable. And then our predictors were year, spatial scale, and species richness. And then we controlled for taxa, where we use taxa as a random effect in our model. So here in table 1, we have all the values, the minimum and maximum values of occupancy, abundance, and the number of plots, sites, and domains sampled for all the taxas considered in our studies. So we can see that some taxas, they can be more abundant than others, and they can occupy a higher fraction of the areas that are sampled. And in general, what we observed here, as we can see in figure 2, is that in this figure, we have year in the y-axis, and then we have the standardized slope on the x-axis. The color red, gray, and blue, they are the plot, site, and domain spatial scale. So we can see that there is a general positive relationship between species abundance and occupancy. And we observed that for all the taxa that we consider in our study. Only ticks that are being shown here in the G panel had those relationships. Those relationships were significant only in the 3 last years that we consider, in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Even though we found this general positive abundance and occupancy relationships, those relationships, they tended to be quite weak, as we can see here in figure 3, where we have these heat maps showing the R-squared values observed for the relationships that we evaluated. And we can see that for the majority of the taxa, the R-squared values, they tended to be quite low, being 0.2 or below 0.2. Maybe the only exception to that are ticks that are being shown here in the first row, where you can see that there are squared values for those analyses. They tended to be a little bit larger. So in our linear mixed effect framework, we show that, as we can see also in this figure, in figure 2, in our linear mixed effect model, we observe that these relationships, they tend to be spatially consistent, which means that the strength of the abundance-occupancy relationships was not different across the different spatial scales. And these abundance and occupancy relationships, they also tended to be temporally consistent, meaning that these relationships did not get weaker or stronger over time. So we observe the same pattern of abundance and occupancy relationships across the years where we obtained data in our project. So in general, we were able to observe that species abundance and occupancy are generally positively correlated. So we supported the occurrence of positive abundance and occupancy relationships for both the aquatic and the terrestrial taxa considered in our study. We also found that these relationships, they are robust to the spatial scales that we consider. Here we consider 3 different spatial scales, and the strength of those relationships, they were similar across these different spatial scales considered here, and that these relationships are not sensitive to sampling years, meaning that we observe the same patterns of abundance and occupancy relationships across all years where we analyze the occurrence of these relationships. So these are our general findings. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have a great day.